Ralph was 67, a retired school teacher who had always taken pride in his morning walks and carefully brewed coffee. On one otherwise ordinary Tuesday, he felt a sudden pounding headache while reaching for the sugar jar. It was sharp, unrelenting, and unlike anything he had ever experienced. The room seemed to tilt around him, and when he tried to stand, his legs felt shaky, betraying his usual steadiness. Alarmed, he sat down, heart racing, and a thought he had never entertained before crept in. Something is really wrong. That day, his doctor's visit confirmed his fear. His blood pressure was dangerously high, far beyond anything he had ever seen on his own monitor. I remember sitting with Ralph in the small consultation room, his hands nervously folded over his cane. "I've always eaten well," he muttered, almost apologetically, "but this, I never imagined it could happen to me." His eyes were heavy with worry, not just for himself, but for the life he wanted to continue living fully, gardening, tutoring his grandchildren, savoring the quiet mornings he so loved. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just about numbers on a chart. It was about fear and the realization that small choices over decades could suddenly demand attention. Ralph's story was about to change, and the path was as much about his mindset as it was about what he put on his plate. Over the next few weeks, Ralph began noticing subtle shifts. Mornings no longer greeted him with a dull ache in his temples, and the dizzy spells that once interrupted his breakfast faded into memory. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't pills alone. It was the gentle, deliberate way he began choosing his meals, the colors and textures of foods that seemed ordinary, but carried extraordinary potential. He discovered that some of the simplest ingredients in his kitchen, beets from the farmer's market, handfuls of berries, bright green leaves, had the power to quietly support his heart. Each bite became an act of reassurance, a small promise to himself that he was reclaiming control, slowly but steadily. What struck me most about Ralph was his humility. He didn't need dramatic interventions or complicated routines. He just needed to see that change was possible and that it could fit into his everyday life. Even when fatigue crept in after a long walk or when the afternoon stretched long and quiet, he persisted. He learned to savor the process, to notice the way his body responded, the subtle easing of tension in his chest, the steadiness in his pulse. This was transformation in its gentlest form, a combination of awareness, intention, and the quiet joy of nurturing oneself. By the time he returned for his follow-up, Ralph's eyes had a spark that had been absent the first day we met. He smiled almost shyly as he described adding colorful vegetables to his morning omelet or sprinkling garlic into sauces that simmered on the stove. There was no rush, no drama, just a steady, heartfelt commitment to his own well-being. In his journey, I saw something universal: the power of everyday choices, the strength found in simplicity, and the reassurance that it's never too late to start again. For Ralph, and for anyone watching this, the message was clear. Transformation doesn't arrive in a single moment. It unfolds gently, one conscious decision at a time. Harold never used to hear his own heartbeat, at least not like this, not pounding in his ears at night like a war drum. He was 67, retired from the city maintenance crew, with hands still rough from decades of labor. But now, in the quiet hours after midnight, when the world went still and even the dog stopped shifting in her sleep, Harold would lie flat on his back and listen to the pressure. It wasn't poetic. It was scary. It throbbed against the pillow, as if something deep inside was demanding attention he didn't know how to give. His wife, Marlene, had told him for months to see the doctor. "You're red when you come in from the yard," she said. "You puff climbing the stairs." But Harold, stubborn as he was, chalked it up to age, until the night he nearly blacked out in the garage. One moment he was tightening a bolt on the mower, the next he was gripping the workbench, blinking hard, trying to stay upright. That shook him, not enough to tell Marlene, but enough to sit very still in the dark and think. It wasn't the thought of dying that got to him. It was the idea of becoming a burden. Harold had always been the one who carried things, who fixed the sink and shoveled the walk. He didn't know how to be the one who needed help. That night, he Googled his symptoms on an old iPad with a cracked screen. Hypertension, silent killer, stroke risk. The words blurred, but one thing stood out: celery. That's what started it. Not medication, not a hospital scare, but a quiet decision to try something that sounded almost laughable. The next day, he sliced a few celery stalks and added them to his lunch. It wasn't heroic, just a sandwich with a crunch on the side. But there was something calming in the crispness, something clean. He didn't tell Marlene, not yet. He wanted to see if it made a difference. Over the next week, Harold kept eating his celery, sometimes with peanut butter, sometimes plain, sometimes chopped into soup. And though he still heard the thump in his ears, it was fainter, less angry. Later, he'd learned from his doctor that celery contains phthalate, natural compounds that help relax blood vessels and improve blood flow. But Harold didn't know that at the time. All he knew was that for the first time in months, he felt like he was doing something. Not waiting, not worrying, but acting, quietly, softly, like his heart was finally being listened to. The kitchen had always been Marlene's domain, not because Harold wasn't welcome there, but because she had a way with flavors, soft, comforting, familiar. Her soups could mend moods, patch arguments, and make winter feel like a warm blanket. So when Harold quietly asked her one afternoon, "Mind if I help with dinner tonight?" She looked up from her cutting board, surprised. He didn't explain, just reached for the knife and started chopping more celery. That night, they made soup together. Carrots, onions, garlic, lentils, and Harold's now regular handful of chopped celery. The house filled with the kind of scent that clings to your clothes and hugs your memory. Over dinner, Marlene asked, "What's with all the celery lately?" Harold hesitated, then told her about the pounding in his ears, about the garage, about how he didn't want to wait until something worse happened. She was quiet for a while. Then she reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You should have told me," she said, "but I'm glad you're doing something." That was the turning point, not the food itself, but the moment he let someone in. A few days later, Marlene came back from the market with something new. "Beets," she said, holding up a bunch with their deep purple roots and leafy tops. "I read they're good for blood pressure too." Harold wasn't sure. He remembered them as those slimy pickled slices from school lunches. But Marlene roasted them, drizzled with olive oil, seasoned just right, and served them warm over a bed of greens. To his surprise, they were sweet, earthy, bold. That night, Harold slept differently. There was a strange kind of lightness in his chest, not like a cure, but like a whisper of hope, like something was shifting in his body, or maybe in his thinking. What neither of them fully grasped yet was that beets are rich in nitrates, which the body converts into nitric oxide, helping to widen blood vessels and lower pressure. But again, this wasn't about science for Harold. It was about noticing how his fingers didn't swell as much, how his shoes didn't feel tight at the end of the day. It was subtle, but real. And perhaps most importantly, he began to believe that small changes mattered. That food wasn't just comfort, but also quiet medicine. That healing didn't have to be loud to be effective. So Harold kept eating beets, not every day, but enough to remember that his body was listening, and finally, he was listening back. Harold's mornings had always begun the same way: a stumble to the kitchen, a muttered good morning to Marlene, and a strong, dark cup of coffee in his favorite chipped mug. It had been his ritual since his 20s, one that grounded him, kept him human. But lately, that first cup made him feel edgy, not awake, not alert, just tense, like his chest tightened instead of opening up. And he noticed his fingers trembled ever so slightly as he read the morning paper. That's when Marlene gently stepped in. "Why don't you try something else? Just for a few days?" she asked, sliding a glass across the table. It was cloudy, pale green, and didn't look remotely like something Harold wanted to drink. "What is it?" "Cucumber water, with a little lemon," Harold blinked. "Why?" Marlene smiled in that way only someone married for 40 years could. "Because I want to keep you around longer." He gave in, not out of curiosity, but out of love. And that morning, for the first time in decades, he didn't start his day with coffee. He sipped the cucumber lemon water instead. It was refreshing, cool, calming in a strange way he didn't expect. It didn't jolt him awake like coffee, but it didn't leave him jittery either. He didn't miss the buzz. In fact, he felt more even, more settled. And over the next few days, he realized something even more surprising. His blood pressure readings, taken on the little monitor they'd bought together, were trending lower, not dramatically, but consistently. What Harold was learning, without needing to be told, was that cucumber is rich in potassium, a mineral that helps balance sodium levels in the body and ease tension in the blood vessels. And paired with water and lemon, it gently supported hydration and circulation without the spike and crash of caffeine. One morning, he caught his reflection in the window. His eyes looked less puffy, His skin seemed calmer. He chuckled to himself and raised the glass like a toast. "Not bad for pond water," he muttered. The most unexpected part? He started to enjoy it, the cool glass in his hand, the ritual of slicing the cucumber just so. It became a small act of self-respect, quiet and personal. And soon Marlene was drinking it too. They started walking after breakfast. Just 15 minutes around the block, nothing serious. But with every step, Harold felt like he was nudging his body back into balance, not punishing it, not forcing it, just moving with it. Like the water, like the cucumber, like the gentle way change works when you let it. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of gray, forgettable day when the grocery store aisles feel a little too quiet. Harold walked slowly behind the cart as Marlene picked through avocados, weighing each one in her palm like a seasoned judge. He wasn't really paying attention, just scanning the shelves absently until his eyes landed on a familiar bag. Nuts, specifically walnuts. He hadn't thought about them in years, not since his daughter used to bake banana walnut bread every Christmas. He picked up the bag, turned it in his hand. The back of the package had a small note in fine print. Supports heart health with omega-3s. Harold raised an eyebrow and dropped them into the cart. Marlene didn't question it. She noticed. She always noticed. "Planning to bake?" she asked with a grin. "Planning to live longer," he replied, half joking, but half not. That week, Harold started snacking on a small handful of walnuts every afternoon. At first it was habit, then it became comfort. The crunch, the richness, the simplicity. It didn't feel like health food, it felt like something solid, honest, and old-fashioned. After just a few days, something shifted. The pressure in his head was less constant. The dizziness, though still occasional, didn't last as long. But what truly surprised him was how full he felt. Less craving, less nibbling. The usual late-night hunger had dulled into quiet contentment. Harold didn't know the science, not really, but he felt the result. Later, his doctor would tell him that walnuts are rich in alpha-linolenic acid, a type of plant-based omega-3 fatty acid that helps reduce blood pressure by easing inflammation and improving arterial function. But Harold didn't need all that. He just needed to feel less fragile. One night after dinner, as they watched the news, Marlene looked over and said, "You seem lighter." Harold smiled. "Maybe I am." He wasn't shedding pounds, he wasn't training for a marathon, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a man fighting his own body. He felt like a man listening to it. A few weeks earlier, he would have scoffed at the idea that nuts could do anything real, but now he felt the quiet power of consistency. And he started to believe in food again, not as a quick fix, but as an ally. A quiet friend that shows up day after day, doing its work inside you while life keeps moving on. He went to bed that night without the usual hum in his ears, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't lie awake wondering if his heart would betray him. Harold never liked garlic, not raw, not roasted, not minced, not powdered. As a younger man, he claimed it was the smell. It stuck to his hands, to his breath, to his shirt sleeves. Overrated, he'd say. Too strong. Marlene, of course, disagreed. She called it the soul of any proper dish. "Garlic is life," she'd often declare while chopping it with that little rhythmic tap, tap, tap that echoed through the house. But now, at 67, standing at the stove while Marlene ran a late errand, Harold stared at a single bulb of garlic on the counter. Something about it felt different, not threatening, more like a small dare. He'd read somewhere, probably in one of Marlene's health magazines, that garlic could help with blood pressure. He didn't remember the details, just the feeling that it might be the next right thing to try. So he peeled it, clumsily, bits of papery skin flying everywhere. He sliced one clove, then two, then three. He added it to a pan with olive oil, watching the little white slivers begin to dance. The scent bloomed, sharp, earthy, ancient, and for the first time in his life, Harold didn't pull away from it. He leaned in, he tossed in some chopped spinach, then cracked 2 eggs. Simple, strange, new, but it was delicious. When Marlene walked in 20 minutes later and caught the smell, she stopped mid-step and stared at him like she was seeing a ghost. "You cooked with garlic?" she asked, wide-eyed. "I know," Harold said with a smirk. "Write it down, August 12th. They laughed, and she kissed him right there in the kitchen, apron and all. That night, as they sat on the porch, Harold felt oddly proud. Not because he had cooked, but because he had changed, even just a little, and the change had tasted good. He didn't know then that garlic contains allicin, a compound that relaxes blood vessels and helps reduce pressure by improving the elasticity of arteries. He didn't need a study to feel the difference. Over the next week, his home monitor showed quieter numbers. The spike he'd often see after meals began to level, slowly, softly, like garlic itself. Bold but never hurried. It wasn't a miracle. He still had off days, but more often he felt steady, less anxious, and something else surprising happened. He started looking forward to cooking, not just for the health benefits, but because it made him feel capable again, useful, alive. Garlic had always seemed too strong for him. Now he realized he had simply never let it in. And somewhere between the sizzle in the pan and the silence of a calmer heart, Harold discovered that sometimes the very thing we resist the longest ends up being exactly what we need. The nurse's hands were gentle but firm as she wrapped the cuff around Harold's arm. The machine let out a soft beep as it hummed to life, the digital numbers flickering into focus. Harold sat still, his feet flat on the floor, eyes tracing the beige patterns on the exam room wall. He wasn't nervous, not exactly. But he also wasn't calm. This was his follow-up. 3 months since that night in the garage. 3 months of celery, beets, cucumber water, walnuts, garlic. 3 months of choosing with intention, of letting go of old habits, not with force, but with quiet curiosity. The monitor beeped again. The nurse smiled. "Much better this time, Mr. Keene." Harold exhaled slowly. "Yeah?" 128 over 76. That's a solid improvement. He nodded, the numbers sinking in slowly, like a warm wave rising over his chest. Marlene, seated beside him, squeezed his hand. The doctor came in a few minutes later, reviewed his chart, asked the usual questions. But this time, Harold had answers that didn't include pills. He had stories, meals, walks, mornings without coffee, evenings without pounding in his ears. "You're trending in the right direction," the doctor said. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." That sentence stuck with him all the way home. Back in their driveway, the garden was in bloom. Marlene had planted spinach and herbs along the fence line, and in the far corner, little green shoots were beginning to rise. Beet greens. Harold stood for a moment, just breathing in the air. He reached down and tugged a tiny sprig of parsley, chewed it slowly, smiled. That afternoon, they celebrated with something he never would have touched before, a bowl of plain Greek yogurt topped with sliced bananas and a sprinkle of cinnamon. Marlene insisted it was good for the heart. Harold didn't argue. Bananas. That was the final surprise. Not new to him, just newly respected. Rich in potassium, bananas help balance sodium and ease pressure on blood vessels, much like cucumbers had done. But this time, it wasn't just the food. It was the feeling that his whole life had softened into something steadier. He no longer checked his blood pressure every morning. He didn't need to. He knew his body now, could hear it when it whispered, could respond before it had to scream. Harold didn't become a health nut. He didn't throw out everything he used to enjoy. But he shifted, gently, consistently, with the kind of patience that only comes from truly wanting to live better. Not longer, just fuller. And somewhere between the roasted beets, the quiet walks, and the garlic on his fingertips, Harold found what he hadn't even known he was looking for. A second rhythm, a steadier life, a heart that finally felt quiet. It was the first time in years Harold didn't dread his birthday. He turned 68 that morning, quietly, without fuss. There were no balloons, no noisy gatherings, just Marlene, a stack of pancakes, and a single candle flickering in the soft morning light. But this one felt different. Not because of any grand event, but because of what he'd promised himself the night before. Harold had stayed up late, looking through old photo albums, pictures of him in his 20s, leaner, sunburnt, with wild hair and wilder plans, pictures of his daughter on his shoulders, of backyard grills, of road trips and fishing weekends. And then quietly, the photos stopped. Or rather, they thinned out. Fewer smiles, more grays, and the look in his eyes, somewhere along the way, had changed. He closed the album and whispered aloud, "I'm not done yet." That was the promise. Not to be young again, not to chase lost time, but to stop letting his health steal the color from his days. He wanted vibrancy back, not just numbers on a chart, but in his breath, his pace, his laugh, in how long he could stand without needing to sit. So, on his 68th birthday, he added something new, dark chocolate, just a square or two after lunch. Not the sugary kind, but rich, real, 70% cocoa and above. He'd read it helped with blood flow and pressure, but more than that, it made him smile. The richness, the way it melted, the way it felt like a reward without guilt. What Harold didn't know, though he'd hear later from his doctor, is that dark chocolate contains flavonoids, compounds that support nitric oxide production, helping relax the arteries and improve circulation. But again, that wasn't why he ate it. He ate it because it reminded him of being alive. Because after months of being careful, of watching every ingredient, of measuring and managing, this felt like a return, a celebration, a middle ground between joy and healing. Marlene joined him, 1 square each. They sat on the porch with their coffee substitutes and laughed about the first time Harold ever tried kale and spit it out like a child. He didn't need a gift that year. He had something better, a future he could look forward to. And in that small square of dark chocolate, in that morning light, Harold tasted what he'd been missing all along: hope, balance, and a life still rich with flavor. It started as a simple suggestion. "Let's walk to the market this Saturday," Marlene said, stirring her tea. "It's not far, just 3 blocks. Harold hesitated. He hadn't done the market walk in over a year. The slope on Maple Street always winded him, and last time he tried, he needed to sit on a stranger's stoop halfway through. But now, something inside him was different. He didn't just feel lighter, he felt capable. So that Saturday morning, with the sun still soft and the street damp from dawn, Harold laced up his shoes and tucked a cloth bag under his arm. Marlene walked beside him, not rushing, not chatting too much, just being there, step by steady step. By the time they turned onto Maple, Harold felt the usual tightness in his chest, but it passed. He slowed, breathed, and kept going. And when they finally reached the market, something bloomed in him. Not pride exactly, something quieter, like a part of him had been holding its breath and was now finally exhaling. They wandered among the stalls, ripe tomatoes, local honey, little jars of pickled things he couldn't name. But what caught Harold's eye was the salmon. It wasn't the color or the price. It was the way the man behind the stall talked about it. "Wild caught," he said, "pulled in 2 days ago. Cold waters, clean fish." Harold looked at Marlene. "Let's get it." That evening, they grilled it simply. Lemon, dill, olive oil. The flavor was delicate, nothing like the heavy fish dishes Harold remembered from his childhood. It melted on his tongue. It felt healing. He didn't know yet that fatty fish like salmon are rich in EPA and DHA, 2 forms of omega-3 fatty acids that reduce inflammation, improve arterial flexibility, and lower blood pressure naturally. But he felt it. That night, his pulse didn't drum in his ears. His sleep came faster, deeper. What mattered more, though, was this. The walk had not defeated him. The fish had not overwhelmed him. He had faced both and found joy. That Sunday morning, Marlene asked if he wanted to go again next week. Harold didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, birds on the fence, light spilling through the leaves, a life unfolding gently, day by day. "Yeah," he finally said, "let's make it our new thing." And just like that, a tradition was born, not rooted in recovery, but in rhythm. Not about fixing what was broken, but celebrating what was still strong. It came in the mail, tucked between a bank statement and a coupon flyer, a letter from his daughter, handwritten, with careful curves and little hearts above her E's, just like when she was a teenager. Harold sat at the kitchen table, his glasses halfway down his nose, and read it twice. She'd noticed, she said, the difference in his voice when they spoke, the steadier pace in his steps when they visited, the fact that he didn't fall asleep on the couch halfway through board games with the grandkids. "You just seem more alive, Dad," she wrote, "and I wanted to say thank you for trying, for staying with us." Harold blinked hard, folded the letter, unfolded it, folded it again. He didn't cry, not really, but something loosened in his chest that felt like grief, or maybe grace. A quiet, overdue forgiveness of himself for letting his health slip into the background for so long. That night, instead of watching the evening news, he pulled out the blender. Marlene watched from the doorway, amused. "What are you making?" "Something green," Harold said. "Figured it's time." He blended spinach, half a banana, a splash of almond milk, and a few frozen kiwi slices he'd bought on impulse the week before. The color was bold, almost glowing. He raised the glass like a toast. To staying here. The first sip was tart, bright, surprising. It woke up his mouth, then his mind. He smiled. What he didn't realize yet is that kiwis are high in vitamin C, potassium, and natural bioactive compounds that support endothelial function, helping the blood vessels dilate, improving circulation, and gently reducing blood pressure. But none of that mattered at the moment. What mattered was that his daughter saw him again, not just as someone aging quietly in the corner, but as someone showing up, changing, living. He started making the smoothie a few times a week, sometimes with kale, sometimes with berries, sometimes with Marlene beside him, teasing him for putting too much ginger in. And each time, the act of blending, pouring, sipping, it felt like writing a letter back. "I'm here too," it said. "I'm not done. I'm trying." And somehow that simple message, passed through fruit, greens, and time, began to rebuild something even deeper than health: trust, connection, the belief that it's never too late to be seen again. It was a warm evening, the kind that arrives quietly at the end of spring when the breeze is kind and the world smells like rain-soaked earth. Harold sat in the old wooden garden chair, the one with the chipped arm and faded cushion. His grandson, Ethan, was sprawled in the grass nearby, trying to coax a ladybug into his palm. "Grandpa," Ethan asked suddenly, not looking up, "were you ever scared?" Harold paused. The garden buzzed gently with bees. He looked at the boy, just 8, barefoot, eyes full of endless tomorrows. "Scared of what?" he asked. Ethan shrugged. "Of getting old." Harold chuckled, then sighed. "Not until I started to feel it." And there it was, simple but true. He had never feared birthdays, never feared numbers, but he had feared losing control, losing rhythm, losing the quiet hum of his body working the way it used to. That had scared him more than anything. "But I'm not scared now," he added softly. "Why not?" Harold looked at the garden, the spinach leaves curling toward the sun, the tiny tomato buds just beginning to peek out. He thought about the beets in the back corner, the salmon dinners, the cucumber water, the garlic, the walnuts, the dark chocolate, the kiwi smoothies. "Because I listened," he said, "and then I did something about it." Ethan nodded, as if that made perfect sense. He didn't ask for more. Later, as the sky faded into peach and lavender, Marlene came out with 2 mugs of warm hibiscus tea, steeped deep red, like wildflowers in spring. She'd read that hibiscus could help lower blood pressure, and Harold had grown to love the ritual. It was tart, a little floral, and somehow felt like winding down in a glass. What he didn't know in detail, but could feel, was that hibiscus contains anthocyanins and natural compounds that act as ACE inhibitors, gently easing the constriction in arteries and supporting the body's natural rhythm. But by now, Harold had stopped needing science to believe in change. He had become the proof. He sipped the tea slowly. The breeze danced through the garden. Ethan ran off chasing something invisible, his laugh trailing behind him like a ribbon of light. Harold leaned back in his chair. He wasn't young, he wasn't perfect, but he was present, and that meant everything. He looked at Marlene and raised his mug. "To the quiet things that save us." She smiled and clinked hers against his. "To the ones who notice them." And in that moment, simple, quiet, entirely unspectacular, Harold felt the deepest truth of his entire journey. Health doesn't begin in panic or pressure. It begins in noticing, and then choosing again and again to care. Harold didn't change overnight. He didn't chase a miracle or sign up for a strict diet plan. He simply began listening to his body, to his wife, to the subtle signs that something inside him was asking for help. What began with a stalk of celery in his sandwich became a journey of rediscovery, not just of health, but of self. The man who once ignored his pounding heartbeat learned to soften into stillness. He replaced fear with curiosity, caffeine with cucumber water, and doubt with quiet consistency. And through each small act, garlic on the stove, a handful of walnuts, a walk to the market, Harold found not just lower blood pressure, but renewed connection with Marlene, with his daughter, and even with his own heartbeat. His transformation wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was made of everyday choices that added up to something stronger, steadier, and full of life. So maybe, like Harold, you've heard the signals. Maybe your body has whispered through tension, tiredness, or a pulse that won't let you rest. And maybe now is your moment to pause and gently begin, not with fear, not with urgency, but with care. Try a new food. take that short walk. Drink the water, eat the beet, slice the garlic. Let one quiet change lead to another. Your heart is listening. And somewhere between the first step and the next breath, you might just find what Harold did. That healing isn't a battle to win, it's a rhythm to return to.